kind of social systems and kinship structures that she considered were initially characteristic of the earliest phases of the Neolithic. But what he had was increasingly, and this I'm now moving into the late 60s and early 70s, you had the view that matriarchy couldn't possibly have existed. So I mentioned earlier the fact that most hunter-gatherer and horticultural societies where you do have a monopoly of ritual power, the men will say this is difficult to maintain. Women have an unfair advantage over men, and they have that unfair advantage because they're female. So if you ask the question, can female biology confer power? As far as most hunter-gatherers are concerned, and horticulturists, they would say absolutely. In fact, the kind of power which females can derive from their menstrual cycles, because it connects them with the moon and becomes what's obviously negatively termed witchcraft, is actually an unfair advantage which women have. But in 1974, Joan Bamberger wrote one of the most famous essays, really, in early feminist studies of the 1970s. And she wrote The Myth of Matriarchy. And she described all those myths where you find that people assume at a deep level that women have particular powers which are intrinsic to being female. According to Bamberger, that is pure male ideology. Those myths are made up simply to scare women and scare young people as well, young boys as well, that if you allow women any freedom, what you're going to get is chaos. And so there's absolutely no truth in those myths which are so widespread around the world. And so she's basically saying no hint of matriarchy has got any shred of truth. It couldn't. And then another very important essay, of course, equally famous, Shelley B. Ortner in 1972, is female to male as nature is to culture. And here, and this, of course, when I began to find out about these things in the 70s, it just seemed to me so, I don't know, so sad. I mean, it seems so obvious to me that feminism has to be the solution to our current politics, that the notions of women's power, women's rights, and something is absolutely central. Without that, we're not going to get anywhere towards any kind of liberated society. And it's so sad to see that in the 70s, the academic feminists, the ones who became most prominent, would argue that there's just no possibility of matriarchy. It never exists. It's a pure myth. And what Shelley Ortner said in 1972 is we find women subordinated to men in every known society. The search for a genuinely egalitarian, let alone matriarchal culture has proven fruitless. And it is important for the women's movement at large to face up to this fact. So I'll just read a little bit more of this because it just gives you how this was argued. So Ortner says, an example from one society that has traditionally been on the good side of the ledger vis-a-vis the status of their women will suffice. So do you think one example will suffice? And then comes up with this example. Among the matrilineal Crow, Robert Lowy points out that, quote, women had highly honorific offices in the sun dance. They could become directors of the tobacco ceremony and played, if anything, a more conspicuous part in it than the men. They sometimes played the hostess in the cooked meat festival. They were not debarred from sweating or doctoring, nor from seeking a vision. Nonetheless, and here Ortner comes up with a sort of punchline, women during menstruation were not allowed to approach either a wounded man or men starting on a war party. The taboo still lingers against the coming near sacred objects at these times. So the very fact that among the Crow, doesn't matter what enormous status women had, there's some sense that menstruation is sacred or taboo. That means that you know this is obviously a patriarchal culture. And of course, as I imagine everybody knows, Ortner's argument was just an extension from Claude Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss says culture was established by men in the process of exchanging women between them. So if culture is established by men, and what you've got is culture itself is not just a male product, but it's intrinsically male. So it is female to nature's to culture. What Ortner was saying was that women have bodies, their bodies condemn them to childcare. Childcare means isolation in the isolated home. Men only can escape to do cognitive, mental, political things and make connections with each other. And so to fight against patriarchy, in order to win that fight, you'd have to abolish culture itself and get back to nature. And so the whole feminist project is just doomed, because you're up against not just men or male power, you're up against culture itself, because female to male is as nature is to culture. An extraordinary argument. And I remember when I came across this, I just thought, I don't know, it was just so confusing. Luckily, actually, there's somebody here in this group listening. I came across Denise Arnold's work with the Matriarchy Study Group. And it was just rather, it was very reassuring to discover that where some feminists had this view that the whole feminist project is just impossible, you're up against culture itself. There were other feminists who argued actually that just fighting for a kind of place within the male world, arguing, for example, that a woman is as good as any man. In other words, using men as a kind of standard of measurement. Women have to try to measure up to something which, of course, they would never be able to do. Women with their biology would never be quite perfectly male. There was another whole strand of feminism which was arguing that really the whole structure had to be overturned, and that some kind of social society had to be established in which being female was the source of your power. Well, the idea that somehow whatever you did, female biology would take you away from power was a strange attitude for feminists to put forward. So what began to happen was that women scholars were put beyond the pale unless they conformed to ideas of that sort. And I'm thinking of a number of thinkers. Elaine Morgan, of course, was one, a woman who was a very senior major scientist, who argued that some aspect of aquatic life or semi-aquatic life played a crucial role in hominin evolution. Throughout Elaine Morgan's life, she was regarded as marginal, as a bit cranky, as I don't know, just totally one-sided, not really worth taking very seriously. And it took a man what happened was that a primatologist, Richard Wrangham, very recently, about 10 years ago, wrote about the origin of the hominins. So we hominins walk on two legs. It's almost the definition of being an hominin, is that we're the ape that became bipedal, walking on two legs instead of four. And Wrangham argues that the only factor which could possibly explain that is some kind of semi-aquatic lifestyle. It looks as if those hominins about 6 million years ago began to forage in mixed waterside ecologies along the edges of rivers and lake shores, and needed to forage for underwater tubers and shellfish and so on. And as a result of that, were buoyed up by the water and began to walk on, increasingly become bipedal, which you have to do in the water, otherwise, of course, you'll drown. And what Richard Wrangham's done, I notice, is claim this theory as his own. He doesn't even mention Elaine Morgan. And more than that, he describes his theory as the savanna hypothesis, he defines the savanna when he has a special definition of savanna, and the savanna includes lakes, rivers, watersides, mixed watersides, and marshes. And so, of course, we now have the prevailing view of hominin origins is the one which Elaine Morgan put forward, but Elaine Morgan's name never appears, and it's claimed as if that whole theory was invented quite independently of her. So now I'm coming to Maria Gimbutas. And all through the 70s until her death in 1994, Maria Gimbutas was questioning patriarchal assumptions as a groundbreaking archaeologist studying the early Neolithic. And she published a huge range of books and articles, but was comprehensively rubbish. And even now, I just looked today at Wikipedia. And in Wikipedia, if you read about Maria Gimbutas, it still says that her arguments are unfounded, shaky, ideological, excessively fake, feminist, one-sided, and so forth. What I want to do is just turn to something which is quite interesting. I'm a little bit out of my depth here. It's not by no means my field. Luckily, I've got Lionel Sims here in WotC and people who are much more familiar with archaeology than I am. But what I want to do is, first of all, just go to what happened in archaeology in the 70s and 80s. And this was this kind of idea that one of the reasons why Maria Gimbutas was flaky was because she was interested in meanings. She was looking at symbols, and particularly looking at religious symbols. And this was regarded as not science. It's bound to be sort of ideological if you start doing that. And what you had to do, you had to be tough-minded. You had to be scientific in the sense that none of the natural sciences are scientific, and above all, you had to quantify things. And so quantification became the name of the game. And if Maria Gimbutas was looking at figurines, for example, and iconography, that meant that she wasn't couldn't possibly be considered scientific. But actually, Maria Gimbutas, she was a brilliant archaeologist. And what she noticed, and I just now moved to your screen showing instruction. Why didn't it work? Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, just there. Right. This is Gimbutas's theory about the origin of the Indo-European languages and peoples. And what is you can just see in this, I think you can see on the kind of right-hand side here, this is what you call the Kurgan cultures. And what you noticed was that this is about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. And what you noticed was that that far right-hand corner of that map here, the burials were what you call big man burials. You had very elaborate burials for particular high status figures. And she, from that, and from noticing it elsewhere, further to the south and east, you had much more equal burials, much more signs of general egalitarianism, and also the burials tended to be much more collective. She inferred over a period that what happened was that a patrilineal warrior society, the Kurgan culture, began to move right across Europe, carrying with them their languages and their traditions. And they conquered the old European, much more matrifocal is the way she put it, much more gentle, woman-oriented, matrifocal cultures, and in that way spread the Indo-European languages. So based on the roughly egalitarian graves and other material evidence, she concluded that the Neolithic societies of Europe and Anatolia had once had what she called a balanced, non-patriarchal and non-matriarchal social system. And to express this balanced culture, she expressly avoided using the term matriarchy, using several other terms. She died in 1994, and what's happened is that, and I was mentioning how quantitative sciences and sciences which are part of natural science have a status which sometimes shakes the establishment and forces them to come to a different view. What happened is that when it became possible to get old bones and genetically analyze them and look at the DNA and look at how the particular forms of these patterns of DNA spread, what happened was that despite having been vociferously opposed by the person, Colin Renfrew, Lord Renfrew, a Tory peer, he had vociferously opposed Gimbutas's whole model. And he suggested that in fact the Indo-Europeans weren't a particular tribal group with a culture. It was just the fact of farming spreading very gradually and sort of imperceptibly. The techniques of farming just spread further and further from Mesopotamia up north and up west across Europe. So there were two rival theories, and Renfrew really quite vociferously and categorically repudiated Gimbutas's theory. But it just so happened that in the last 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, the geneticists have, and this I only learned of this quite recently. It was actually Mark Thomas here at UCL who gave a talk and just told us, he's a senior geneticist, of course. He just told us that in fact, the genetics now have proven that after all that, Maria Gimbutas was correct. In fact, the Kurgan culture, there were actually people who moved west, and the only explanation really is that they did actually move with their warriors, their horses, their chariots and stuff, and did actually move and increasingly conquer those more matrifocal cultures. So in a lecture called Maria Rediviva, which kind of means Maria triumphant, of course, in Latin. DNA and Indo-European origins. Lord Colin Renfrew, who'd been, as I say, the kind of gatekeeper for archaeology and a powerful, vociferous opponent, gave a lecture. This is in 1917, I think, really recently. And he ended with these words: Maria Giboutis's Kurgan hypothesis has been magnificently vindicated. And so in the lecture, Renfrew explains that Giboutis's Kurgan hypothesis about the spread of Indo-European languages from the steppes north of the Black Sea by invaders she called Kurgans turned out to be correct. So before their arrival, the people that Giboutis called Old Europeans buried their dead in communal graves with grave offerings indicating no great difference in wealth or status and no domination of one sex over the other. And although Renfrew didn't necessarily go all the way with her interpretations, the fact that he'd vindicated her basic theory on genetic grounds meant that it opened the floodgates really to actually looking once again at those findings that she'd made. So there's up there on that purple patch there on the Black Sea, the Tripoli culture. Now, I'm sure most people here who come to radical anthropology will know about the horribly sad death in August last year of David Graeber. Much more successful as a radical anthropologist, much more successful in getting the message of the value of anthropology in giving us other modes of being. Like anyone who thinks maybe another world is possible, you need to study anthropology. And David Graeber did a wonderful job in making anthropology accessible, almost popular, and breaking out of the kind of ghetto that anthropologists have actually wanted to be in, hogging, like conserving their knowledge as if it was some kind of precious treasure, but which in general people shouldn't know too much about because they might get kind of ideas, much as, of course, Professor Malinowski suggested, some of these ideas about other ways of being human, the idea that other worlds are possible can actually be too dangerous. So Graeber did a wonderful job. But what I've just recently discovered is that, and that's because of David Wengrow, who's been telling us about it, that Wengrow and Graeber have got a book coming out called The Dawn of Everything. And Wengrow has been giving us talks on video about this, about his part of the contents. And where are we now? So what they're saying is that archaeologists in Ukraine and Moldova got their first inkling of something like even cities being gender egalitarian in the 1970s, when they began to detect the existence of human settlements older and much larger than anything they had previously encountered. So let's just move to that one first. Actually, here, can you see that? Yes. And these are sites going right back about 7,000 years, often referred to as mega sites, so somewhere between 6,000 and 7 years old. So this means that some of them existed, these sites, in that area just to the south and west of the Kurgan region, so in Moldova and the southern Ukraine. They existed even before the earliest known cities in Mesopotamia, and they were also larger. And yet, and so let me just read this is actually a quote from chapter 8 of The Dawn of Everything. But even now, right, David Graeber and Wengrow, but even now in scholarly discussions about the origins of urbanism, Ukrainian sites almost never come up. Indeed, the very use of the term megasite is a kind of euphemism designed to signal to a wider audience that these should not be thought of as proper cities, but as something more like villages that have for some reason expanded inordinately in size. Some archaeologists have even referred to them as overgrown villages. So how do we account for the reluctance to welcome the Ukrainian megasites into the charmed circle of urban origins? The answer we would suggest, this is where growing graver, is largely political. Actually, it's political in a double sense. Some of it's just modern geopolitics. Much of the initial work of discovery, of course, was carried out by Soviet scholars, and that meant that those findings could be dismissed. But perhaps even more, they say, it had to do with the internal political life of these prehistoric settlements themselves. So there didn't seem to be any evidence of centralized government or administration, or indeed any form of ruling class. In other words, these enormous settlements had all the hallmarks of what evolutionists would call a simple society, not a complex society. Now, what I want to do is slightly radical. Now, this is a completely different part of the world. This is a picture of a Canella village from the air. Now, the Canella are, until very recently, hunter-gatherers with a little bit of, these days, gardening in the northeastern highlands of Brazil. And what you can see here is the circular pattern of the village. And a village like that was, around are these houses. Each house is a communal house, and the house is owned by a group of women, rather like an Iroquois longhouse, but the point is you've got kind of a whole ring of them. And if you can see that picture here, running from north to south as a dividing line. And what you have is the people of the East are all married to, I'm using the word married, it's not quite the right word because it's bride service. No man ever ends up with any kind of sexual rights in his wife or his partner. But the people on the East are in a marital relationship with the people of the West. And it's matrilineal and matrilocal. So you have two matrilineal moieties, two halves. And the men, they crisscross between their wives and their sisters. I'm using the word wife because I'm not quite sure what other word to use at the moment, but it's not a very satisfactory word. So what happens is that the men, as they crisscross from side to side of this huge bicycle wheel, they mark out these spokes of the wheel, these paths you can see. And so a man will go in the evening to his, if you like, bride's longhouse and stay there the night. And then in the morning, he's got responsibilities to his sister's household on the diametrical opposite side of that bicycle wheel. And he will go back to his sister and discuss family affairs because his children are, of course, his sister's children. And he's looking after the religious responsibilities, the ritual responsibilities, the childcare responsibilities of his children, who is his sisters. But what happens is the men are duolocal. Every man has got two homes, and every man has to crisscross morning to evening between his sexual partner's home and his sister's home. And that's the reason for those bicycle spokes. Now, there's no central administration here. That center there is a dance ground. In fact, all around, just inside of the circle, inside of those longhouses, there's a big space for dancing. And the two groups, they meet and part. And dancing is their form of government, if you like. Dancing and singing is how they organize life. Men are certainly not more powerful than women. The women own the homes. You can say, sort of, I suppose, women's place is the home here, but the home is where everything happens. It's the center of power in the whole village. And all I'm doing is just, and perhaps I should just say one more thing, which is that when the missionaries came along, they tried to persuade the Canella, also sometimes called Timbira, depending which group you do. They tried to persuade them their villages would be much neater if they were in a straight line in a street. And the Canella people just absolutely wouldn't agree to straighten out their villages. They had to be in a circle. And of course, you can immediately see why a circle is a natural arrangement for an autonomous community that aren't centralized. As soon as you've got a long table, you've got somebody at the head of that table. As soon as you've got a long street, some people are going to be dominant over others, and the circle is kind of signifies really the periodic circular bottom-up form of organization which they have. And what I want to do now, having shown you that picture, I want to show you this one. And I hope you can see a kind of similarity, because everybody who's written about the Tripolia culture, now this is the culture before the Klogans, before the very ancient culture, which, as David Graeber and Wengrow point out, has, this is absolutely huge, by the way. It's about 300 or more dwellings, maybe 40 or even 50,000 people, about 6 or even 7,000 years old. No sign of inequality. There are no houses, no houses are bigger than other houses. There's no palace, there's no military headquarters, there's no moats or anything. It's extraordinary. It's clearly, as Wengrow Graeber point out, I mean, to say matriarchal, who can tell? You can't really tell that, but it's certainly not a centralized, top-down, administered town. It's clearly somehow self-organized. You can see that simply because of the way in which the buildings are so equal. And one of the points that David Graeber makes is that circularity is just a key everywhere. It's a key to the art. Even the houses themselves have got these like curved outsides. And clearly, being in the home in one of these, in a village, in a mega city, almost like a mega village, almost a town, would mean an enormous amount of connectedness between the different homes. So a nice screen here. Yes, some 40,000, 50,000 people. Okay, and these are the art objects found in those. There's about 20 or 30 of these huge mega villages, if you like, kind of towns at this very, very early stage. So the houses have all got openings, entrances and exits, sort of connecting them all up. Now, okay, now where have I got to here? I just want to perhaps just look at now, one of the things which Wengrow Graeber point out is that yeah, what Wengrow Graeber is saying, there's been this extraordinary taboo on matriarchy ever since the early part of the 20th century, and they're not really saying anything substantive about matriarchy or patriarchy, but they're simply saying, why has this taboo been so absolutely categorical? Why has it been absolutely impermissible to even discuss controversies around matriarchy? So perhaps I'll read this out here now. Kind of notes. Oh yes, I've got it now. They're saying in the dawn of everything, we enter something of an academic no-go zone and discuss the possibility of Neolithic matriarchies. This merits a brief digression because the very idea of primitive matriarchy has become such a bugaboo. I'm quoting from David Wengrow and David Graeber in chapter 6 of their book. Even suggesting that women had unusually prominent positions in early farming communities is almost an academic taboo. It's hardly surprising that the whole topic became something of an embarrassment, even the intellectual equivalent of a no-go zone for subsequent generations. But it's hard to avoid the impression that something else is going on here as well. The degree of erasure has been extraordinary, far more than is warranted by mere suspicion of an overstated or outdated theory among academics. Belief in primitive matriarchy is treated as a kind of intellectual offense, almost on a par with scientific racism, and its exponents have been written out of history to gauge from the history of feminism. This is odd. After all, the century does seem more than enough time for the dust to settle. Why is the matter still so shrouded in taboo? So I'll stop there. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Chris. We could have a lot more to say about the whole Cucuteni Tripoli, and if anybody knows more, please chip in.
I should say I'm right out of my comfort zone talking about any of that stuff. I've just discovered it, and it just seems rather fascinating.
Please unmute yourselves if you've got questions or comments or contributions.
I want to hear from Lionel.
Lilith is talking about Jerusalem as well. Lionel?
We'll say something if you want now. Yeah. I was wondering if anyone else wanted to say something first rather than, but Chris, that was a wonderful talk. Many thanks. I knew nothing of this book by Wengrow and Graeber, and the first thing I'm doing tomorrow morning is buy that book. Very interesting.
The only trouble is you can't because it's not coming out for a few months.
Okay. How come you've got it, Chris?
Well, it's because David Wengrow has been doing interviews, and he can use a kind of robot to translate a talk, and he's given us an insight into chapters 8 and 6 only. It's a terrible shame.
Okay, okay. You've got friends in low places, obviously. Okay. Well, very good. And I was particularly with Eleanor whispering in my ear, only in Britain can you hear such an extreme reaction against matriarchy theory, because of course, can I speak for you? Eleanor from a culture which still has strong memories of peasant life. These cultures cannot treat women in this way. They cannot talk about women in this way. And of course, there will be political inequalities as well. But nevertheless, within the folk culture, within the fairy tales, within the myths, this is still very, very current. But of course, in Britain, our industrial revolution and our political revolution under Cromwell was so long ago and so anti-women right at the beginning with the Puritans, that there's been this massive political antipathy towards women having a key role to play in the life of a culture, that we get these extreme things, an extreme opposition to the matriarchy thesis. Now, my research is in Stonehenge, Avebury, and various other places in the Neolithic. And I've been doing this now for about 20 years. And the opposition to my papers that I submit to archaeology journals is appalling. It's rude, it's offensive, they're angry, because I'm arguing that these monuments in the Neolithic are a monumentalized version of putting women down for finally. The final blow against women is in the monuments, the way the monuments and the reason for the monuments being built. So this brings me up with a word of caution, Chris. It's not opposition at all, but remember, Stonehenge is a circle. Avebury is a circle. And my argument is that the people who built these monuments are perverting the meanings of circles by making them, through astronomy in particular, say the reverse of what a circle should really mean. So therefore, there's this intertwining within the symbolism in the Neolithic, in which circles are being manipulated for a rising elite of wealthy cattle owners. There's another word of caution, because if we, and of course, what you were doing in your talk, I think, was contrasting what it was before, when we had mass big game hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic, and what it became much later with agriculture and cattle pastoralism, with a vehemently patriarchal political code. But in between those two processes, there is a very, very long, drawn-out process, very long. And I've got some friends in the Basque Country who took me down into caves in the Basque Country. And in one cave, in one valley in particular, it was absolutely clear to me that this cave was a place for male initiation, in which shamans were running initiations for young men, and that this was in some way a way of displacing blood rituals and blood power and appropriated for men's use as well. And there were all sorts of economic problems. And this was in the Magdalenian in 15,500 years ago. So I would argue that locally, there's lots of variations. And the British archaeologists in particular, Renfrew and Ukko, those were the two that did in Maria Gimbutas. And they were doing them in partly, some of it seemed to ring true with the way in which they used other contrary evidence to Maria Gimbutas, which you can find in certain localities. So when you've got a mixed up myriad of symbolisms and meanings, the right wing, and that's what they are, Renfrew and Ukko are right wing, they made appalling statements about the Venus figurines that Gimbutas was using, saying that they were just children's toys, children's dolls, stuff like this. That therefore, we also have to be aware of how in some of the details, we can't just use binary models, to opposite models between matriarchy and patriarchy. But otherwise, Chris, fantastic stuff. Sooner or later, I will get that book.
Just to say that Maria Gimbutas carefully avoided the binary models. I know you know this, but I mean, she was very careful not even to use the word matriarchy. She knew that it can't be one-sidedly matriarchal in a sort of permanent or static sense. There's always, there's always a cyclicity and a periodicity to these things. That women's ceremonies, men's ceremonies, and the cyclicity of in time is marked out in the cyclicity in space in those as well as all the spirals and cycles on the figurines themselves, clearly showing that this cyclicity is intrinsically connected with the female much more than with the male.
Yep.
There's a few questions in the chat. Is there anybody else would like to chip in?
Yeah.
Marina, you had something?
I did.
Who? Ian, go for it. Ian.
Yeah.
Do you want?
I mean, I've been behind the times a bit, and so I was shocked to hear that Renfrew had made such a mea culpa.
Amazing. It's because of the genetics. You can't argue with genetics.
Fantastic. Can't argue.
But he could have just stayed silent. I mean, it is. I do find it a bit bizarre that he was so openly making what is essentially a mea culpa.
Yeah. He staked a huge part of his life on cancelling really Maria Gimbutas, and he got it wrong. I mean, it's great.
I can only think that to put this in some historical context, part of the reason that Maria Gimbutas's work attracted such attention in the 70s was the feminist movement. But once there was no longer a movement, once it had become sort of academic feminists who themselves participated in demolishing Gimbutas's arguments, then it became much safer.
She never lived to see her vindication. It's so tragic. She, died in 1994. Rather like Elaine Morgan never lived to see her vindication by all the various patriarchs like Richard Wrangham, who now all use the aquatic ape theory as if they've invented it and write Elaine out of it. So what these women have to do to get into the citadel, to be treated seriously, I mean, everything's stacked against them. But then what's absolutely extraordinary is that one or two women managed to make it, and so Sarah Hurdy somehow has made it with what, after all, is almost the most controversial thing of all. I mean, group motherhood, for God's sake, it is now absolutely standard. We wouldn't have our brains without group motherhood. You know, and nearly everyone agrees with that now. They're finding it impossible to argue with.
Yeah, they just say they don't put it like that,
No.
Chris, and they try to neutralize it every way they can because they still think alloparenting means mummy and daddy. Yeah, that's what they think.
Oh my
So,
God.
I mean, if you really put it to them that no, it means female kin coalitions. But you know, Hurdy prevaricated. She wasn't as clear cut as she might have been. But yeah, but it's the implication is that, yeah. Anybody else want to contribute? Marina had a question about whether matriarchy was being asked about before Barkhofen. Was there no conception of patriarchy versus matriarchy? Perhaps we could say more about what we mean by matriarchy, because we've been chucking this word around, and Gimbutas wasn't chucking the word around.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I've given several lectures on did matriarchy ever exist. I can't, sorry, can I? You want me to just say a bit about it, Camilla?
No, I just, yeah. Yep.
Sorry, I mean, I deliberately decided to go way out of my comfort zone and not talk about what I really know about, or what we in RAG mostly know about. So just for anyone that's not, you know, doesn't quite know, in RAG we have this wonderful idea. It's called communism in motion. That's an expression invented by Morna Finnegan, and it describes what African hunter-gatherers do. So African hunter-gatherers are big game hunters, or at least have been until quite recently, and they are, all of them pretty much, are gender egalitarian. So women have an enormous amount of solidarity and power. And it's kind of matriarchy because every now and again, roughly once a month, but maybe not exactly, maybe every 3 weeks or 5 weeks sometimes, but anyway, now and again, when the women feel they've really got to teach the men a lesson, they impose women's rule. And with the Benjeli, the people that my colleague Jerome Lewis knows best and Mona Finnegan knows best, this is a ritual called Ngoku. And Ngoku is a momentary, like a week-long women's rule, very raucous invasion of men's space, taking over the whole camp space, and hugely raucous, full of laughter, making fun of men's bits, performance in bed, testicles and everything else, a huge laugh at men's expense, which men have to put up with for a whole period. And then later on, the women get a bit fed up with ruling and you know, feel like surrendering their power, but they don't surrender their power until they kind of know that they can have women's rule again. And so you get a kind of a pendulum. The women rule, then men rule with their own ritual called a Jengi, and then the women rule. And I think we're all agreed in RAG at least that the original pendulum would not have been once a day or once, you know, day and night, and certainly wouldn't have been seasonal. It would have been roughly lunar. It would have been roughly once a month, moving between women's rule and men's rule. And we call that communism in motion, or we call it lunarchy, ruled by the moon. And so we don't quite believe in matriarchy in the sense we don't think matriarchy was ever fixed or permanent as a state. It was always part of a rhythm of seizing power and surrendering it, seizing it and surrendering it.
Great. Ed, do you want to say something about the Stonehenge for Lionel?
Oh, well, I mean, just to say what I wrote in the chat, really, that, I mean, Stonehenge was built by the Bell Beaker people. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in all of this. This is only my understanding. And that these Bell Beaker people were part of this Kurgan migration that arrived in the UK in around 4000. So they must have given up hunting and gathering a long time before they arrived in Britain. And I always had assumed that Stonehenge was built by a people that were in the process themselves of transitioning from hunting and gathering to pastoralism. and therefore they were trying to appropriate the ritual magic of what had gone on before to this new way of living, as you argue. But if these people have given up hunting and gathering a long time before they even arrived in Britain, then I guess I'm a bit confused. And I mean, is it that they're arriving in a culture and trying to kind of control a kind of indigenous population, or how does this recent genetics influence your whole argument about Stonehenge? I don't know if that made sense at all.
Yeah, it's okay, Ed. Yes, it does. However, the Bell Beaker people probably didn't actually arrive on these islands in Britain until about 2300 BC or 2400 BC. So if you were watching the programme on BBC last Friday, where we saw Mike Parker Pearson, the trench archaeologist, saying that the Stonehenge began in Wales, which, by the way, the myths of Merlin all say as well, from a stone circle there made by the Bluestones, 3300 BC. And then there were later 4 modifications. Once those stones had been moved to the Salisbury Down, there were 4 versions, different versions of Stonehenge, and none of those versions were built by the Bell Beaker people. They came just at the end of that building process. Their drinking cups arrived a bit earlier because that's what they are. The Bell Beaker pots are drinking cups for people who follow an axe cult, and they are determined cattle pastoralists who also are pig farmers. Now, the thing is, the people who built Stonehenge were mainly cattle herders, but they were continuing to hunt and gather. So, and occasionally, but only very occasionally, did they plant any crops. And one of the main theories is that these grain crops that they planted were not for making bread or anything like that, but they were for beer, they were for alcohol, for the rituals that they were conducting. So therefore, the picture is of a very variegated economic structure to the people. But what is amazing is that there is a great uniformity in their ritual life, in their monuments. So economic variability with hunting, gathering, cattle herding, and a little bit of planting, grain, crops, in this great mixture, which varied very much. For example, in the Orkney Islands, it was overwhelmingly intensive farming, whereas in Wiltshire, it was overwhelmingly cattle herding. But within these different economic systems, there are different sorts of marital exchanges that are appropriate. So in hunting and gathering, a man proves himself to a woman by being a good hunter. But if a man has a herd of cattle, then he purchases a wife in perpetuity with a bunch of cattle. So therefore, this changes intensely the social position and social status of the women, so that in hunting exchanges, women are in a strong position in that a man has got to prove himself as a good hunter. Whereas if he's a cattle owner, he just purchases a woman from another group, and then he keeps that woman on pain of the other group losing their cattle that he gave to have their daughter. So these are politically, for women, utterly reverse situations. Now, when it comes to Stonehenge and Avebury, we can map this amazingly through the symbolism of their astronomy. And that's what I'll be talking about on the 16th of March, I think it is, in the RAG class here, because we will find that at both Avebury and Stonehenge, there is the malappropriation of monthly blood rituals. and not just monthly blood rituals, but blood rituals staged every 9 or 10 years. And there is a reversal of women's blood by being appropriated by coalitions of men appropriating blood rituals. And we can see this in both Stonehenge and Avebury. So therefore, yes, it's complicated. All the bits you just talked about, the beakers, the women, the hunting, the cattle herding, all those bits are there. And we need to put them together precisely, which shows that everything that Chris has just said about matrilineal power preceded patrilineal power, we will see the turn in place where that all turned decisively in the favour of elite Catalonian men. It decisively changed at Stonehenge and Avebury round about 2500 BC. That was the mark by which they said, we've arrived, we're now in control.
Great. It's worth asking a question about in view of what Lionel's just been saying about Tripoli, Cucuteni, and the economy that is supporting these incredibly large settlements. So my understanding, I don't know very much about it, but my understanding is there may be some livestock, but there is still a certain amount of hunting. There is agriculture, probably more like horticulture, and fishing, very rich fishing in the Dniester Valley Plains. And so it's a very mixed and abundant economy, but it's kind of remarkable whether there was any actual livestock, or presumably not a large-scale pastoralism, nothing like nomadic pastoralism. If we compared maybe to, just say you could compare, for instance, I was just going to suggest, so you could make a comparison perhaps to the matrilineal belt to some extent, the African matrilineal belt where there's lack of cattle, but there could be very complex townships, for instance, Yoruba townships were very large-scale settlements indeed, with very mixed economies. And even though patrilineage is, still women's role as seniority very, very prominent. Anyway, Chris.
It's just that I can see quite interesting parallels between the circles of the Canella, or the Ramco Camecra, or the Timbira as they're called. Very, very rich. I mean, apparently only maybe a couple of hundred years ago, the Canella were almost entirely hunting and gathering, and yet they had these relatively settled circular villages. They had, it was so fertile. There was so much game and so much food they could gather around that although they did have manioc and certain vegetables, their gardening wasn't basic. There was strangely almost sedentary hunters and gatherers, the Canella, and it does seem as if the Tripoli, Cucuteni mega cities at least started out something like that way. As you said, Camilla, there's such extraordinary fertility along those bends of the rivers, and so much fish. And they did have all kinds of grains. I mean, they had barley and wheat and different grains, and they had already started to domesticate some cattle and pigs, but they weren't pastoralists. I don't think they certainly weren't roaming around with their cattle, and they had to cut. They had not exactly plows, but they had, I think they called hack plows. You just sort of hack at the ground with a sort of big hoe. But I'm just saying there's remarkable similarities, and it's almost as if Tripoli was a Ramco Camectra or a Canella circular village writ large. They just got bigger and bigger and bigger because they could get bigger. And then I think, and the other interesting thing I didn't mention is that every 60 years or so, they'd completely destroy the entire settlement, but they'd rebuild it in almost the same place and in the same way. It's almost as if they felt the sort of death and new life, more or less corresponding to a human lifespan of 60 years, as part of their cyclical logic of life. They didn't go for anything like megaliths. The idea of permanence of anything was probably antithetical to their whole worldview. You know, the idea of huge pyramids, huge stones, huge boulders is a particularly patriarchal version of immortality, and the idea that they seem to have had in Tripoli was much more. You don't get immortality by keeping your soul living forever in a fixed state. You get immortality by dying and coming alive again in a periodic way, and that applies to the whole settlement. Astonishing. And then that's linked to the David Graeber idea about the Upper Paleolithic, where you have a huge amount of periodicity, where you have a sort of like the seasonal variations of the Eskimo. You have hierarchy, and then you establish it for a bit, maybe for one season, and you establish your hierarchy in order to have the great fun of pulling it all down again, and then you keep having a revolution, and then a sort of playful counter-revolution, then another revolution. You're oscillating between hierarchy and egalitarianism. Something like that seems to be happening with the Tripoli, I think, although I don't want to go too far down that road, because actually there's no evidence of hierarchy. I mean, really, there's no evidence of any inequality in the way of the buildings. There's certainly no centralized top-down admin going on there. And you can't have bottom-up management of an entire vast population without it being matrilineal and matrilocal. As Mary Douglas explains, you need a kind of grounded logic of going to and fro, which actually generates connectedness, and that has to be the webs of kinship going to and fro, then are going from one place to another, just between sister and sexual partners, so weaving these bonds, which mean that there's no space for the state to fill. An admin the top-down admin couldn't get in there, because the sort of bottom-up kinship networks, which have to be matrilocal and matrilineal, because otherwise they're not bottom-up, are just too strong to allow a sort of ruling caste or an administrator or an army or something to start organizing anything from above. Needs more work. Needs somebody that knows and makes it a specialism. Somebody needs to do a PhD on all this.
Hannah, do you want to say something? Or any? We're asking Hannah.
I knew that was going to spike that. I'm sorry. Whilst I was really enjoying everything that's been said, I was just really noticing that it's been very male dominated whilst we're listening to this whole thing. I was really interested, wondering if any female speakers were coming in tonight. That's all. Thank you.
Any contributions?
Where is Denise? Denise, where are you?
Odette, you were asking a question too.
Well, I've got a question if a male is allowed to ask a question after the perfectly fair comment.
Go for it, and then the women.
Put my video on. Sorry, I just wanted to ask Chris. Thank you for that fascinating lecture. I mean, are there any patterns that people are discerning in what causes a society to be or become matriarchal or patriarchal? And are there any consequences in terms of how the different sorts of societies evolve? You know, can we trace, for example, the matriarchal societies, are they more static? Are they more evolutionary? Can one draw any sort of comparison between the consequences of one form of organization as opposed to another?
You've asked the great question of the last 100 or so years in anthropology. It's extremely complex, as Lionel was saying. There's no reason why horticulture necessarily leads to a big man arrangement, but in Papua New Guinea, there's no question that it did. There's pretty certain that pastoralism, cattle, is the enemy. That cattle are the enemy of matrilineal. There's not much doubt about that, but even that isn't universal, because the Himba in Namibia, they have cattle, and they're very not female dominated exactly, but the women have an enormous amount of solidarity and sexual freedom. So it's actually extremely difficult. And one of the things which Graeber says, which I don't quite agree with, but it's his main point really, is that he says, just expect surprises. Don't think there's going to be kind of laws. I mean, the subsistence does kind of matter. There's certain constraints involved, but as soon as you look at history, you just discover that as soon as you think of a law, for example, that farming will lead to fences and therefore private property, you'll find that there's lots and lots of exceptions to that law. I will sort of say that something we were discussing just a moment ago is probably true. For any kind of communism, including communism in living, you need abundance, you need economic abundance. And any kind of scarcity is going to lead to conflict and competition, and dominant individuals will take advantage of the conflicts and competition and impose their dominance more. Now that applies to the great apes, and certainly to the chimpanzees, where the most male-dominated chimpanzees are those in the most scrubby areas, where females find it really hard to find enough food for themselves and their babies, and therefore females are very intolerant of rivals in their cabbage patch, and then the females are isolated, and therefore that enables a bunch of male chimpanzees to dominate them, because the females have got no solidarity. Whereas as soon as the chimpanzees moved south of the Congo and found they could forage together, it's in an incredibly abundant, resource-rich, semi-aquatic environment, the females started to band together and kind of beat up any male who got in their way and became matriarchal. Now, I think there's something like that applies to human history as well.
Would that imply that if you take these mega sites, for example, you have let's assume it's a matriarchal or matrilocal site, eventually it's going to become so successful that the resources which were previously abundant will become insufficient. So by a sort of evolutionary pressure, you'll then have a situation in which, if I've understood you correctly, male dominance will arise, at least for a period, because there'll be greater pressure on resources and the males will be able to exert power to...
I think you've got it. And what I know about Aboriginal Australian kinship and gender relationships is that in the more arid western desert areas, the more dry and dusty, arid, where there's very little vegetation, and women have to scatter far and wide to get their tubers and other food. Those are the most extremely male-dominated areas. Whereas in Western Arnhem Land, along the coast of northern Australia, with enormous abundance of all kinds of turtles and game animals and bulbs of all tubers and stuff, women are much more likely to forage together and have much more solidarity and power. So that's but as you say, as soon as you have a very big mega village, you're going to eat out your surroundings eventually, and then of course you're in trouble and the whole thing will start to collapse. Yeah.
Any more questions from women? Female speakers? Anybody?
I'm hoping Denise is going to say a little bit.
We've got lots in chat. Denise, have you got a contribution?
All right. Well, I was just going to say about the matriarchy study group that Chris mentioned. I think it was in the early 70s, and it wasn't really an academic group at all. It was a feminist group, and it was a consciousness-raising group, and the idea of matriarchy was an idea of power, and it was a very successful idea. We would read Bachofen and Morgan and Engels and study ancient Crete and all kinds of things, and it was very, very fascinating. And it was also interesting because when it started, we did a publication on menstrual taboos and another one on the politics of matriarchy. And Pauline Long, who was one of the most active people, much more than I was, in it, one day couldn't get into her house because the front garden was just full of flowers. It was just an enormous gift from all the people who had suddenly reacted to this as something completely different and another way of looking at society. So it had very many interesting consequences. I went off then to the Andes to study and lived among the Aymara for a long time. And there it is a dual system. And the women are the owners of the animals and pass on the animals predominantly through the female line. The men inherit land. So the rituals around the animals are all centered in the women, and you get female symbolism and so on there. So that's an interesting example of female control over herding as well. That's it.
Are you aware, Denise, you have a lot to answer for, because your pamphlet on menstrual taboos was probably the thing which turned me round to sort of seeing everything the right way round when everyone else had seen it the wrong way round. Everyone had seen menstrual taboos as necessarily, demeaning, polluting, debasing, and all that stuff, patriarchal. And I think it was, well,
yes, I wasn't actually involved in that publication,
oh,
but
wow.
it was very, very powerful at the time. It had a wonderful red cover, I remember. And yes, Chris was really taken by it. And, and so it's come up until now, until this group. So it was a thing of its time. And people are now writing theses about it and so on. So it was very...
Are they writing theses about the Matriarchy study group?
Yes, yes.
Oh my God.
And it's linked with Chris Knight, so
oh my God.
To hear that.
No, nobody's come to interview. Has anyone come to interview Chris or Denise?
They've come to interview me, and I'll try to find details about it and send it on to Chris.
Yeah, I did mention the Matriarchy study group and Denise, you, in my book Blood Relations in the intro, didn't I? I did say, it was you had a huge influence on me. I can't quite remember the words I used, but I mean, it's just such an important part. Pamphlets, and you in particular, yeah.
Yes.
But we're still just as much tabooed, outcast as we were, I think.
Well,
almost.
there are other examples of kind of under the surface or outside respectable academia, big areas of matriarchy study, like the German matriarchy expert Heidi Göttner Abendroth, and she's got a whole school. They run big conferences. Someone in the chat was referring to the Mosuo. So there's whole areas of study of like the Chinese or the tribal corridor Chinese ethnic minority groups that have matriarchal systems, and there's a lot of as well in indigenous. In fact, Dasha might know more about it. Some of the First Nations Canadian are who of course linked to Mohawk and Iroquois and so on, are very interested in the subject of matriarchal culture and kind of women's political, at least political influence and leadership, if not supremacy. So there are sort of matriarchy has been squashed out of anthropology, but it's gone and it's popping up in all kinds of other areas. Male-dominated, respectable anthropology and archaeology have pretty much forced it elsewhere.
Perhaps just say one thing, which is that Ian was asking, and Lionel was asking, how it was that Colin Renfrew caved in because of the genetics. And of course, there's another whole lot of genetics, which has come up recently, proving that maternal local residence is the default, probably original residence norm among hunter-gatherers. And so we've had I could show you a screen with a whole bunch of, Camilla knows them very well, but they're Verdu et al. And Destro Bistrol and et al. A whole bunch of studies in absolutely top rank, genetics papers showing that in Africa, among the immediate return hunter-gatherers, and nearly all African hunter-gatherers are immediate return, means they don't practice storage because it's the tropics, you can't really store the stuff. So among all those hunter-gatherers, women have lived with mum. We don't know quite how long, but it's definitely hundreds of years traditions. Whereas with the Bantu and the farmers, it's women who move out in order to get married. And so with the mitochondrial DNA that's transmitted through the female line, you get these clusters of similar patterns, with the males dispersed all over the place, and with the Bantu farming people, it's the other way around. And that genetics is really substantial now, and it ought to completely blow out of the water the patrolocal band nonsense and all the assumptions about hunter-gatherers being patrolocal. They're not. They're pretty much. Jerome, by the way, is absolutely stressed this. Jerome just says with a Benjeli, it's not just a choice that women make that you're going to live with your mum. No man can possibly expect to do anything else until he's had 2 or 3 children. You go and visit your sweetheart. You have to prove yourself. Any moment she can say, no, sorry, I've changed my mind. There's never a marriage contract. A man never, manages to get sexual rights in a woman. And Jerome just saying everything he knows about it. I mean, we know that that applies to the Hadza, but Jerome's just saying that with all these hunter-gatherers, you have map to local residence, and it's proven genetically. And once you've got map to local residence, you've got a matrilineal bias in the descent system. It doesn't have to be a clan exactly, because most hunter-gatherers they're mobile, they move around a lot. But as soon as those hunter-gatherers do settle down even a little bit, you're going to get a map to local, matrilineal, something like a moiety system or clan system forming, because the logic of it is already there from the very start, right back. And we're saying that would go right back because it's part of that Sarah Hurdy, women living with gran to get their mother's support, and therefore living with sisters, and therefore the shared childcare.
It's worth saying something on the genetics picture for this movement of the Kurgan culture, because there are studies in the last few years that are demonstrating. So the focus of the studies is not on the MIT DNA, the passing the female line, but on the Y chromosomes that pass on the male line. And what's so interesting is that there is a sudden total collapse in the Y chromosome diversity. So whereas earlier in about 8,000 years ago, there are many Y chromosome lineages, about 6,000 to 7,000 years, it completely changes. And that picture would fit with the Proto-Indo-European movements potentially. It's actually quite early compared to Tripoli Cucuteni. But it would also fit with a picture. I mean, where men are some men who own significant more resources in terms of cattle potentially are gaining so much more reproductive success that they pass to their sons, and that is being perpetuated through Y chromosome lineages.
Like the Genghis Khan effect.
It is sort of that, but it's an much earlier version of that. So it's been proposed. The model that's proposed to explain it is for warfare of patrilineal clans. If you have warfare of patriclans going on, then you're going to eliminate large numbers of Y chromosome lineages very quickly. So it would fit all of that. So it's more of the genetics. Have we got more questions or contributions, or we'll begin to wind this up if there aren't any more, but if there's anybody else. Ivan, there were 1 or 2 people who were saying they were going to ask questions. Igor, anything?
Yes, hello. Good evening, everyone. First, thank you to everyone for this very informative lecture. I have to just quickly introduce where I'm coming from, because my question could perhaps have a lot of mistakes or misconceptions. I come from a little country called Croatia, where I'm still on my MA of cultural anthropology and ethnology. So all of this, what has been presented tonight, is rather unknown where I come from. I unfortunately have self-introduced the whole RAG group, or rather the reading list that is on the RAG website, to myself about 3 years ago. And I started to resend this to my mentors, my professors, and it was quite badly received, especially Camilla's and Chris's texts concerning sex, what we would call actually, yeah. But every piece of text that I would present would be considered unimportant, and mostly what we call here is UK centric, because it would not not co-align with our 19th century, more Herder-like ethnography. So my introduction was a bit longer because my question is regarding the fact that what Chris stated in the beginning of how the radical anthropology group tries not to bring up the divide between cultural, biological, social anthropology and archaeology, but where I come from, or where my discipline comes from, it's very cultural orientated, or rather social orientated. And the question I would ask would be perhaps a methodological one: is how can the whole concept of matriarchy, or bringing back matriarchy, how can we as students, or rather as cultural anthropologists, thinking and working within contemporary issues and fields, how can we use that, or how can we insert those questions? How can we have those questions in local matters, where I believe that that's the question for the whole of Europe. We have very contemporary modern issues that are being intertwined with a lot of modern and pre-modern, actually, ideas that don't have a lot to do with the whole part of the human history that you talked about this evening. So the question would be, how can we use this, or how can I convince basically people around me that this is a question worthwhile?
Right. Chris, challenge?
Say something.
Go on,
Well, what about mentioning Belarus, or mentioning other places where, pre-general resistance to extreme versions of male dominance? The resistance seems to be mostly women, and it seems to me that that's happening. It would be helpful to women to know that in fact, let's look at revolutions, for example, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. In every case, pretty much, the women start these revolutions, and there's reasons why women, their patience is exhausted first. I mean, women have got to feed their kids, they've got a huge lot of loyalty to one another and their children and stuff, and there comes a point when enough is enough, and they take to the streets. So it's too big a question, Igor, for me to answer. And anyway, I'm a man, and I'm not claiming to be having all the sort of answers, but I mean, it seems to me that if you have a view that the Shelley Ortner view, that if you fight against patriarchy, you're fighting against culture, that's not going to help any women in any kind of struggle. And if you have another view, which is the sort of, the view that there's never been anything except patriarchy right through the whole of history, and that the matriarchy myths are just myths. I mean, obviously, if it's true, then women, just as Shelley Ortner says, women should just sort of more or less give up, really. What can you do? I mean, if women have never had power in the past, okay, if that's scientifically true, maybe we just need to give up on so many things about political emancipation and liberation. But fortunately, it's not true. And there's so much now genetic evidence which supports the original theory, not the idea of matriarchy exactly, but certainly the idea that living with mother, strong solidarity, women collectively caring for their children, a matrilineal bias to descent. I mean, so much modern genetics. And I'm only mentioning genetics because it just seems as if the patriarchs, they only take notice when the genetics tells them they better take notice. And that's kind of interesting because, genetics is kind of natural science. It's very hard to fake the genetics. It's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's just there. And I think it needs to be more widely known that the genetics came to the support of Matriarchy Gimbutas. So the genetics now shows us that in the place where we evolved in Africa as hunter-gatherers, matrilocal residence was the pattern, was the norm, and then we can see the reason for that, and then that validates the idea today that households shouldn't be isolated, that we'd all be much happier, children would be better brought up, with much more connectedness between households and streets, much more. We need more music, more street parties, more dancing, more connection between our households, so that the home becomes collectivized and powerful.
Elena, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. I'm coming from Slovakia, and I can understand what you're going through, because I went through the same process as you did, with all the ideas from Chris and Camilla, up to the point that I had to transfer my PhD to London. I worked with Camilla's theory of female cosmetic coalitions, and I applied the theoretical model on Slovak women and their collective cosmetic rituals centered around direct sales cosmetics. You probably know Avon. Everybody in these knows Avon. So I worked there, and I worked with Camilla's model. And what we found was astonishing. First, it supports Camilla's model to the dot, and also it shows that within the ritual situations, there's so much inheritance from, if I can put that word there, from our hunter-gatherers' origins in terms of egalitarianism amongst the women, and egalitarian ritual full of laughter and carnivalesque joy. So it is possible to use this model easily on the ethnographic material, which is in our countries really rich. And I'm sure in Croatia, as well as in Slovakia, there are still memories of all female cultures, for example, in female working groups, for example, spinning, or anything that women did together, where the solidarity can be still seen and traceable and theoretically explained through Chris's and Camilla's models.
Okay.
Wonderful, Ellie. Brilliant.
Okay.
Fantastic.
That's great. Yeah.
I hope Ellie's was very brief there, but Ellie's talking about the way in which the women who supposedly want to sell these cosmetics actually give them away to each other and have a wonderful kind of sexy time with each other. Yeah.
The origin. I mean, the underlying logic should be the sell and buy logic for money. But what emerged amongst the women was gift. What was the logic of the gift, and logic of being the same, not being more than any other woman taking part.
So it's not women.
Ellie should be talking about her work next term, in June. She was going to.
Don't forget to remind me to book it. Make sure that we don't forget to book Ellie for next term.
That would be really great.
It's 8:20.
Anyone else? We're
women.
Past, and some people are sliding off, so perhaps this is time to wind up, unless there's anyone wants to really add something in there. Thank you very much for all the contributions. Next week is really definitely the talk by Malvika Gupta and Felix Padel on the Adivasi school system in India, where there are stolen generations of the Adivasi hunting, gathering children. They've recently written a beautiful article in The Hindu, which has been a very powerful contribution, which we'll post up on the Facebook sites and so forth, if you haven't seen it already. So that will be a very powerful talk. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.